The young man arrived at the office every morning before the sun rose, his shirt clean but simple, his tie always slightly crooked, his shoes worn from too many days of walking. He was not rich, he was not powerful, but he believed in hard work. He believed that if he gave everything, one day it would be noticed. For years he carried files, prepared reports, stayed late when others left, and helped co-workers who often forgot to thank him. His eyes were tired, his hands calloused from writing and typing, but he never complained, because inside his heart he held a dream: to climb higher, to give his father and mother a life without struggle, to prove that effort meant something. Yet in that same office, there was a man who enjoyed breaking dreams. The boss sat in his wide leather chair, dressed in expensive suits, his gold watch shining every time he lifted his hand to point at someone beneath him. His voice was sharp, his laughter cruel, and his favorite target was the young man. Every day he found a reason to insult him. "Your work is slow," he would bark. "Your ideas are worthless. Even a child could do better." Sometimes he threw the young man's reports back at his desk, papers scattering like fallen leaves, while the office filled with silent giggles from co-workers too afraid to speak. The young man would quietly pick them up, his face calm, his silence hiding the storm inside. He thought if he stayed patient, if he worked harder, perhaps the boss would one day see his value. But arrogance never sees truth. Arrogance only sees itself. One morning the office gathered in the main hall for a weekly meeting. The boss stood at the front, smiling at his managers, the staff seated in rows with notebooks and pens ready. The young man sat quietly in the back, his notes prepared, his presentation file carefully made after nights of work. His heart beat fast, because today he was finally allowed to present an idea, a small suggestion for improving sales. He believed it might make a difference. When his turn came, he walked to the front, his hands trembling slightly as he connected his file to the screen. He spoke slowly, clearly, explaining his plan, showing how it could increase profit, how it could save costs, his words simple but honest. Some heads in the room nodded, some managers whispered to each other with interest, but the boss leaned back in his chair, his face twisted into a smirk. When the young man finished, waiting for a response, the boss stood suddenly, clapping his hands once, and the sound was not praise, it was thunder. "Pathetic," he said loudly, his voice echoing. "This is what you bring to me? After all these years, this is all you have? A child's plan? Worthless." The young man froze, his mouth half open, his chest heavy. The boss stepped closer, pointing at him with a sharp finger. "You waste my time. You waste this company's air. You are nothing but a mistake. A failure." The words sliced through the silence, cutting deeper than fire. Some staff lowered their eyes, ashamed for him, but many laughed, eager to show loyalty to the boss. Their laughter filled the hall, bouncing off the walls, turning his humiliation into entertainment. The young man stood still, his ears burning, his heart breaking, but he did not beg, he did not cry. The boss wasn't finished. With a cruel smile he shouted, "Pack your things. You are fired. Right here, right now. Let everyone see what happens when useless men dream too high." Gasps filled the air, then laughter followed again. The young man's folder slipped from his hand, papers scattering at his feet. He bent down slowly, picking them up one by one while the laughter grew. His fingers shook, not from weakness but from the storm rising inside him. He stood straight, looked around the room, saw the smirks, the mocking eyes, the betrayal of people he had once helped, and then he turned his gaze to the boss. For the first time he did not lower his head. His eyes locked on the man who had destroyed him, and in those eyes there were no tears. There was fire, quiet fire, the kind that does not burn quickly but waits, the kind that consumes slowly until nothing remains. He said nothing. He gathered his things, his bag heavy with papers and broken pride, and walked out of the hall. The laughter followed him down the corridor, but with every step the sound grew faint, replaced by the beating of his heart, steady and hard. Outside the building, the sun was blinding, the air filled with the noise of the city, but he felt only silence inside. He walked slowly, each step heavy but filled with determination. The humiliation had cut him. Yes, it had scarred him, but in those scars a seed was planted. He remembered the faces that laughed, the words that cut, the finger that pointed. He repeated them in his mind, carving them deep so he would never forget. At night, alone in his small room, he replayed the moment again and again, each time feeling the sting, each time feeding the fire inside. He whispered to himself, one day, I will return. Not as their worker, not as their servant, but as their master. And when that day comes, he will remember this moment, and he will beg. The world outside thought he was broken, a man thrown away, a failure left to rot. But in truth, he was building something inside, a silence sharper than words, a patience stronger than hate. His revenge was not born in noise, it was born in humiliation, in the ashes of pride burned by public shame. The boss thought he had ended him, but he had only given him a beginning. The young man closed his eyes that night, his fists clenched on the bed, and in the darkness of his room, the fire in his heart burned brighter than the sun. The young man walked out of the office with nothing but a small bag in his hand, and humiliation heavy on his shoulders. The streets of the city felt colder. Every passerby looked like they knew his shame. Every sound of laughter on the road sounded like it belonged to his former co-workers mocking him again. At home his father's eyes filled with worry, his mother's heart broke when she saw her son return empty-handed. But he forced a small smile, telling them it would be fine. Inside, though, his silence was not peace, it was war. He searched for work the next day, and the next, knocking on doors, standing in lines, but no one wanted him. Some had already heard about how he was fired in front of everyone, and they shook their heads politely. Others laughed and told him he should go back to the same boss and beg for forgiveness. Each rejection was a wound, but he did not break. Instead he worked where no one else wanted to, loading crates at dawn, sweeping floors late at night, carrying bricks on construction sites until his back ached. His hands became rough, his body thin, but his spirit sharpened like a blade. He saved every coin, hiding it in a small box under his bed. His clothes were worn, his meals simple, but he spent nothing beyond survival. At night, when the city slept, he sat under a dim lamp with borrowed books, teaching himself business, finance, contracts, and laws. The same numbers that once confused him slowly began to make sense, and in his silence he grew wiser than he had ever been. Some nights, hunger kept him awake, but instead of crying, he whispered to himself, one day. The rivals of life mocked him. Old co-workers passed him in the street. Some smirked, some looked away, none offered help. They had laughed when the boss humiliated him, and now they treated him like dust. But he memorized their faces, not to hate them, but to remember that in the end they would all bow. His old boss grew richer, his company taller, his pride louder. He boasted to investors that he had cut out the dead weight in his staff, pointing to the young man's humiliation as proof of his wisdom. Each word reached the young man like poison, but he swallowed it, letting it turn into fuel. He knew anger alone could not win, only patience could. His father sometimes asked why he worked so hard for so little, and the young man would smile softly, hiding the fire in his heart. Because this is not my end, he would say quietly. This is my beginning. The neighbors gossiped, saying he was foolish, wasting his youth on dreams he would never reach, but none of them saw how carefully he was building himself. He studied contracts until dawn, practiced negotiations in the mirror, learned how money moved like water and how men drowned when they could not control its flow. Slowly, the coins in his box grew, then turned into notes, then into investments. He bought small shares in tiny companies no one cared about, businesses others thought would fail. But where others saw weakness, he saw opportunity. His silence gave him an advantage. No one noticed the poor boy building power in the shadows. Years passed like this. The young man grew older, his shoulders broader, his eyes sharper, his walk steadier. He no longer looked like the boy who had walked out of the office with humiliation on his back. Now he looked like a man forged in fire, trained by hardship, unshaken by failure. And though the world still ignored him, he knew his time was coming. His struggle was not weakness, it was preparation. He was like a storm on the horizon, unseen by those too arrogant to look, but one day they would hear the thunder. The boss who had fired him thought the story had ended. But the young man in shadows was writing a new beginning. One coin, one book, one sleepless night at a time. And when the moment came, when he finally stepped back into the light, it would not be as a beggar or a servant. It would be as a master. Years of silence turned into strength, and strength slowly turned into action. The young man who had once been humiliated in front of an entire office now walked the streets with quiet confidence. His hands still bore the scars of hard labor. His body still carried the weight of struggle. But inside, his fire had grown into something powerful, something unshakable. He had studied long nights, saved every coin, and learned how the world of business moved like a hidden river. Now, at last, he was ready to step into that river, not as a drowning man but as one who knew where to swim. His first investment was small, so small that no one noticed it. A tiny shop that was collapsing, its owner drowning in debt, the shelves empty, the customers gone. Everyone said it was worthless, but the young man saw more than others. He saw potential. He bought the shop quietly, fixing it with his own hands, cleaning floors, painting walls, stocking shelves with goods he carefully chose. Day by day, customers returned, drawn not by the shop size but by the honesty and hard work of the new owner. Where others cheated, he kept prices fair. Where others shouted, he spoke politely. People began to trust him, and trust in business is worth more than gold. The rivals laughed when they heard of it. The old boss too, mocking that the failure was now running a stall. But the laughter did not last long. Slowly, the shop grew. Profits trickled in, then flowed faster. He reinvested every coin, buying another small business, then another. Each time, people doubted him, and each time he proved them wrong. He moved like a shadow, never boasting, never revealing his true plans, only working harder, thinking sharper, and waiting patiently. Months turned into years, and soon his name began to be whispered in the market. Investors who once ignored him now came to him with offers. Employees who had once mocked him now quietly sent applications to work under him. His growth was no accident. It was the result of nights without sleep, meals skipped, books studied, and risks taken with a steady heart. Slowly but surely, his small business grew into a company. He hired people, trained them with discipline, demanded loyalty but treated them with respect, something his old boss had never done. Workers followed him not out of fear but out of belief. This was his greatest strength, and he knew it. Meanwhile, the old boss never noticed the rising storm. He sat in his glass office, still arrogant, still cruel, firing employees for sport, bragging to clients about his power. But small cracks had begun to appear. Contracts he once owned slipped away into the hands of the young man's company. Clients who once trusted him moved their money elsewhere, drawn by the quiet professionalism of the rising competitor. Each loss was small at first, but small cracks break the strongest walls when ignored. The young man smiled quietly as he watched it unfold, never rushing, never revealing himself too early. He knew the game had only begun. His first rise was no explosion, no sudden glory, but a steady climb built on patience and pain. He remembered every insult, every laugh, every word of humiliation, and each one gave him strength to keep climbing. The world thought he was still just another face in the crowd, but he knew the truth. He had risen from the ashes, and he was not stopping. One day soon, the boss who once fired him in shame would look up and see him standing higher, stronger, and untouchable. The old boss still sat in his tall office, behind glass windows that looked down at the city, confident that nothing could touch him. His company was big, his employees obeyed him, his money flowed like a river, and he believed he was untouchable. He did not know that a storm was already moving against him, a storm built from silence, patience, and years of hidden work. The young man had grown his small shop into a chain of businesses, each one stronger than the last, each one stealing customers quietly from the old boss's empire. But he never put his face in the light. He moved like a shadow, using trusted managers, new names, and silent contracts, so no one knew who controlled the rising company. The rivals thought it was luck, a new competitor who would eventually fail. But inside the young man's office, maps of the market hung on the walls, red circles marking every client the boss depended on. He studied them every night, planning how to take each one, not with noise but with silence. His method was simple but deadly: offer better service, lower costs, respect to employees, and fairness to customers. Slowly, deals began to slip away from the old boss. One big contract signed with the boss for years suddenly shifted to the young man's company. Another supplier quietly ended their agreement with the boss and joined the rising competitor. At first the boss laughed when he heard of these losses. "They are nothing," he told his managers. "A child's game. We will crush them later." But later never came, because every week brought another loss. His profits shrank, his investors asked questions, his managers grew restless. Inside his company, workers whispered of a new place to work, a place where they were respected, where their efforts were valued. Slowly, his best employees left, moving to the young man's growing empire. Each departure was another crack in his fortress. The boss shouted louder, insulted more, fired people in anger, but his rage only drove more away. Meanwhile, the young man never stopped building. He hired those same employees, giving them dignity, giving them purpose, and in return they gave him loyalty. He was not just taking contracts, he was taking the very heart of his enemy's power. The silent competition turned into a hidden war, one where no bullets were fired but victories were counted in contracts, clients, and trust. The boss still did not know who his true enemy was. He believed it was just another company, just another face in the market. He never imagined it was the same boy he had humiliated, the same man he had thrown out in shame. That truth was still hidden, waiting like a knife under cloth. And so the days passed, the boss losing more, the young man gaining more, until the market itself began to shift. Investors no longer whispered the old boss's name with respect. They whispered about the mysterious new power rising fast, steady, and unstoppable. And behind that power stood the young man, silent, patient, smiling to himself as he prepared for the day the truth would finally break and the boss would see the face of the shadow that had destroyed him piece by piece. The old boss sat in his glass office one morning, his gold watch shining but his face dark with stress. For months his company had been losing deals. Contracts that once came easily now slipped away like sand through fingers. Clients who had praised him for years no longer returned his calls. Suppliers refused to give him the best goods, and his best employees were gone, taken away by the mysterious competitor. He shouted at his managers, slammed files on the table, accused them of being incompetent, but deep inside he was afraid. The empire he had built with arrogance was crumbling, and he did not even know the face of the enemy who was taking it from him. Rumors spread faster than his excuses. Whispers said a new investor had risen in the city, a silent power who was buying pieces of businesses, controlling markets, and building influence everywhere. The boss dismissed it at first, calling it lies, but when his investors demanded a meeting, when they told him the company itself had been bought by this mysterious hand, he felt his chest grow cold. He stormed into the boardroom, his voice loud, demanding to know who dared to interfere with his empire. The room was filled with his managers, his investors, all silent, their eyes on the door. The boss shouted again, his pride desperate to prove he was still in control. Then the door opened. The sound of footsteps echoed against the polished floor. A man walked in calmly, dressed in a simple but sharp suit, his eyes steady, his steps slow. The boss turned and froze. It was him. The boy he had fired in front of everyone, the one he had humiliated, the one he had called useless, stood before him now, not broken, not weak, but stronger than ever. The room filled with silence as the young man pulled out a chair, sat at the head of the table, and placed documents in front of everyone. His voice was calm, quiet, but it cut through the air sharper than any shout. "You fired me in shame," he said, his eyes locked on the boss. "And you laughed as the office mocked me. You thought you destroyed me. But today, I sit here as the new owner of everything you built." Gasps filled the room, investors leaned forward, managers exchanged shocked looks. The boss's face turned pale, sweat forming on his forehead. He stuttered, trying to deny, but the papers on the table were clear. The shares had been bought, the control transferred, and the throne he once sat on no longer belonged to him. The young man leaned forward, his words slow, heavy, filled with the weight of years of silence turned into power. You once told me I was worthless. Today, you work for me. Or you walk out as nothing. The boss trembled, his arrogance shattered, his pride broken in front of the same kind of audience he had once used to destroy others. The tables had turned, and the man who had mocked a boy now stood powerless before the master he himself had created through cruelty. The reveal was complete, and the silence in the room was louder than any laughter ever could be. The boardroom was silent, the air heavy like a storm before lightning. The old boss stood frozen, his mouth half open, his pride shattered into dust. Around him the managers and investors looked not at him but at the young man sitting calmly in the chair of power. The same chair he once dreamed of but was thrown out from in shame. Years ago he had walked out of this company with his head lowered, his co-workers laughing, his boss pointing a finger and calling him useless. Today the tables had turned, and the one who had been humiliated now controlled everything. The boss tried to speak, his voice shaking. This cannot be real. This company is mine. My blood built it. But the young man's calm reply cut through his excuses. Your arrogance built nothing. Your cruelty burned bridges. Your greed blinded you. You fired me to destroy me, but instead you created me. And now, everything here belongs to me. He slid the papers across the table, contracts signed, shares transferred, ownership sealed with no escape. The investors nodded, some smiling quietly, because they trusted the new master now, not the old tyrant. The boss's hands shook as he reached for the papers, but every line on them told the same truth. He was no longer in control. His empire, his pride, his power, all gone. The young man leaned back, his eyes cold, his voice steady. You have two choices. You can work under me and taste the shame you gave me, or you can walk out of this building with nothing. The room gasped, all eyes on the fallen king who once mocked others. The boss's face turned red, then pale, then blank. His legs trembled as he realized the truth. He had no choice at all. If he stayed, he would live every day under the command of the man he once destroyed. If he left, he would lose everything: his name, his pride, his power. Slowly he lowered his head. The same man who once stood tall and arrogant now looked smaller than ever, and in that moment everyone knew his reign was over. The young man did not smile, he did not gloat, because his revenge was not in words, it was in silence, in power, in control. He had no need to shout, no need to mock, because the image itself was enough. The master replaced by the servant, the tyrant broken by the victim. At last the boss stumbled out of the room, his steps heavy, his pride bleeding with every move. The employees who once laughed at the young man now lowered their eyes as he walked past, ashamed of their past cruelty. Some even bowed, quietly begging for forgiveness, but he gave no answer, only silence. Days turned into weeks, and under his leadership the company changed. Workers were treated with respect, managers were rewarded for honesty, clients returned with trust, and slowly the business grew stronger than ever. People in the city whispered about the new owner, about the man who had been humiliated but had risen to own the very empire that cast him out. They called him the fire that rose from ashes, the shadow that turned into light. And every time someone asked about the old boss, the same answer was given. He was nothing now, a man wandering the streets with no power, no respect, no laughter left in him. The young man sometimes stood at the same spot in the office where he had once been fired, remembering the finger pointed at him, the laughter of co-workers, the shame that had burned his soul. He closed his eyes, and instead of pain, he felt strength. He whispered to himself, "Revenge is complete." And with calm dignity he walked back to his chair, not as the broken man who once left in silence, but as the master who had turned humiliation into triumph.